Hello, and welcome to our industrial maintenance video series. My name is Mario Bringetto. I am an industrial maintenance instructor at College of the Sequoias in Hanford, California. Throughout this video series, we'll be covering multiple topics, including conduit bending, motor controls, part identification, and pneumatics, and other trade-related tasks. In this video, I'll demonstrate the proper process in bending offsets with EMT conduit, and later I will demonstrate the process. Before we can mark our conduit, the first step in determining where the offset is to begin is we have to measure the distance to the obstruction from a known reference point. Another consideration we must take into account prior to marking our conduit is the height of the obstruction. One of the final considerations we must take into account prior to marking our conduit is the degrees of bend. In this example, we'll be using 30 degrees as our degrees of bend, and which gives us a multiplier of 2 and a shrink of 1/4 inch per inch of rise. If you do not take the shrink into account, the top of your offset will not match directly over the top of the obstruction, and it will be before the actual obstruction. Utilizing the previous chart, we were able to get our degrees, our multiplier, and the amount of shrink. Looking at the photographs, we know that it was 24 inches from the reference point to the obstruction. The obstruction is 2.5 inches in height. With 1/4 of an inch of shrink per inch of rise, we take the multiplier of 2.5, which is the inches, times that by 0.25, the shrink, and we end up with 0.625 or 5/8 of an inch. When we add the shrink of 5/8 of an inch to the distance from the reference point to the obstruction, we end up with 24 and 5/8 of an inch. To get the B mark, we know that the multiplier is 2. The height of the obstruction was 2.5 inches, so 2.5 inches times 2 equals 5. That's the distance between bends. If we subtract 5 inches from the A mark of 24 and 5/8 minus the 5 inches, the distance between bends, we end up with 19 and 5/8 of an inch, and that's going to represent the B mark. Before we start bending, there are the steps we need to follow. The first is to select the appropriate bender for the type of conduit we're going to be using. In this demonstration, we'll be using 1/2 inch EMT conduit. As we have our conduit bender selected, we then can lay out the marks. When we lay out the marks on the conduit, be sure to come off of a straight reference edge. Once you have the conduit marked with your A positionings, you can then line it up on the arrow. That's where you're going to need to make the marks as we bend our offset. After you bend the first 30 degrees, which will put the bottom of the EMT conduit at the 30-degree mark, take the pressure off, slide it forward, rotate it, and reline it up on the arrow bend. You can then pull it down to the 30 degrees, which will give you a true offset. So moving on to the demonstration portion, prior to marking our conduit, we need to verify our measurements. So it's 24 inches to the obstruction. The obstruction's 2.5 inches in height. And utilizing the math from the previous slides, we can lay out our marks. The first mark farthest up is at 24 and 5/8, which is the A mark. And the B mark is going to be at 19 and 5/8. Once you mark the conduit, put a ring around it so you have a reference point to bend. And if this is going to be exposed work, do not use a Sharpie. You can't get them back off. So now that you have the ring around the conduit, it's actually time to bend. So now with our conduit marked, the next step is making sure that we use the appropriate bender. We are actually going to be bending 1/2 inch EMT conduit. It's a thin-walled conduit, typically used in commercial applications. You can see. So we need to match it to our 1/2 inch EMT bender, and it's stamped on top of the shoe. So now that we know those two items match, what we do is put our A mark at the arrow of the bender. So once you have those two lined up, it's time to actually start to bend. As we get closer to bending, one thing you want to be aware of is your footing. You don't want the bender just to be floating around like this, because it can move around or even come up this direction. So what I do is I put my toe in front of it, my knee to the back of it, and then you get in tight so that you could actually bend it. Now when you bend it, you're going to bend it from the bottom of the conduit is going to line up on the line of the shoe to make sure you have achieved the full 30 degrees. Now let's bend it. You may have to go a little bit further along to allow for some spring back, but you can lift it up, slide it forward, rotate it over, line up the mark on the arrow, make sure it's lined up straight, get close, and bend it down to 30 degrees. So now we could actually put it in our jig to see if it fits. So now it's time to verify our math and our bending abilities. We have our conduit flush with the reference point. That looks good. The A mark is on top of the obstruction at the edge. That's good, and it's laying flat. I would say that's a successful bend. So that's all we have for you in this video. Check out our next video on how to bend a 4-bend saddle. And thanks for watching.